You're listening to the UnSafe Bible with Pastor Ken Brown.
If you're theologically or politically conservative, like the Calvary Chapel, we tend to challenge progressive social and political attitudes. In other words, we don't buy what the culture says about sexuality, and we don't buy what the culture says about a lot of other things too. So we tend to draw the ire of those who have an axe to grind against Christians, and we get anti-Christian hostility. And actually, Christianiophobia is the irrational hatred and fear directed toward conservative Christians, and it's now being observed in this country.
In Marvel's Avengers movies, there's one substance that is stronger than anything else. It's called Vibranium. With this element, machinery and weapons become more powerful than anything in this world. Whoever controls it has immense power. Today, Pastor Ken says when you're a Christian, people will persecute you. Like Vibranium, God's Word has power. You must use it appropriately and purposefully. Don't use it out of context, but rather use it to correct people if they have the wrong context of a passage. Well, let's join Pastor Ken in the book of 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, as he begins his message, Thessalonians.
We are in 1 Thessalonians, which is encouragement to the church under persecution. That's what it is. And we're going to be doing an introduction, and I call it Thessalonians. It's because we're going to be introduced to the church in Thessalonica, the people of the church in Thessalonica, and kind of some of the background as to who they are and what the church is really like. We're going to find out that this is a church that's under persecution. By the time that Paul writes to them, they are under persecution. So we're going to be covering 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, the whole chapter, I hope, Lord willing. We'll see. But as we begin our study of 1 and 2 Thessalonians, we have to understand that most people believe these are two books written by the Apostle Paul to the church in Thessalonica. But if you take a look at what the text says, you'll understand that there's more than Paul involved in the writing of them. It'd be more appropriate to say, as we look at the text, that this is a letter from Paul and Silvanus, or Silas, and Timothy to the church in Thessalonica. Because we read this in 1 Thessalonians 1:1, Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy to the church of the Thessalonians in God the Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Grace to you and peace. Now, Silvanus, of course, is not a Jewish name. It is a Latin name, but he is a Jew. Timothy is a Gentile name, and we'll talk about Timothy as we get there. But I look at this and I say, how did Paul wind up being with Silas and Timothy? How did they wind up being involved in this second missionary journey? Because this is the second missionary trip when they go to Thessalonica. That's what that is. Because Silas joined the missionary team when it was still Paul and Barnabas. They had actually returned to Jerusalem. They were giving a report. Here's how it went for the first missionary trip. Here's who was saved. Here's what's going on. We're seeing a lot of Gentiles saved. And that was a concern for the folks in Jerusalem because they hadn't seen a lot of Gentiles saved. So they actually had a council meeting to discuss it. And they thought it was a good deal that Gentiles were being saved. So in Acts 15:22, it seemed good to the apostles and the elders and the whole church to choose men among them and send them back to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And they sent Judas, who's also called Barsabbas, and Silas, leading men among the brothers. So they sent them along with them to go visit with the church in Antioch and encourage the church there, because that was another large Jewish community, but they were seeing a lot of Gentiles saved too, and they needed to hear a word from the Lord. So they all go to Antioch to minister, and after encouraging the church there, Silas stays with Paul and Barnabas. So if we take a look at a map of the second missionary journey, you see the dotted red line, they're going up to Antioch, and you see a little black line going off to Cyprus. Well, that's Barnabas and John Mark. They're going to be this disagreement, and they're heading off that way. And Paul's going to be following up into Asia Minor, and he's going to cross over into Greece before it's all said and done, and then he returns back to Jerusalem. Paul's heart is in the mission field. It is. That's where he wants to be. That's what the Lord's called him to do. He has to be there. And he wanted to go back and check on the churches that he had planted in Asia Minor. And he wanted to plant some new ones in Asia Minor too. But there's this disagreement because of a guy named John Mark. John Mark had left the team during the first missionary trip in Pamphylia, and Paul thought he had abandoned them. In Acts 13:13, Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos and came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. Now later they make amends and John's part of the team, but at this point, Paul's not really wanting to have him along. So there's just this disagreement, and it's so angry in terms of a disagreement that Barnabas and Paul actually split. Paul heads off with Silas and Barnabas heads off with John Mark, and they go two different directions. Paul goes north and John Mark and Barnabas head to sea and go to Cyprus. And they're all doing ministry, but now you have two missionary teams. That's how the Lord did that. Instead of saying, hey, we need to send extra missionary teams, the Lord said, let's split you up and we're going to do it this way. And that's what he did. It's at this point that Paul and Silas, as they were moving through Asia Minor, they meet a guy named Timothy. Now, they're both Jewish, okay? Paul and Silas are very, very Jewish. They meet Timothy. Timothy grew up in a Gentile environment, but his mother is Jewish and his dad is Greek. And they weren't practicing Jews because Timothy's never been circumcised. You know, his dad said, what sense is that? We're Greeks, you know. But Timothy had become a Christian. He was a believer. He was following Jesus Christ. We read this in Acts 16, verses 1 to 3. Paul came to Derbe and to Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers at Lystra and Iconium. So Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were there in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Great, Timothy, we want you on the team. Come join us. We're going to onboard you. And by the way, we got this little thing we need to do first. I'm sure Timothy really looked forward to that. You're going to join the missionary team, but because your mother is Jewish, there was something that should have happened, and we're going to do that. Ow. That's not my idea of I've got friends who are with different missionary groups, and I have one good friend who went with Wycliffe, and he said, no, they had nothing like that when he went with Wycliffe. It just didn't exist, you know. Can you translate the Bible into other languages? That's good. That's all we need to know. You know, that was it. But Paul and the team are blocked as they go through Asia Minor. They want to do more ministry. They want to start churches, but they're blocked. They can't do it. The Lord keeps shutting the door. They want to go here. They want to go there. Nothing happens. And they go all the way across Asia Minor, most of the way all the way across what is now today Turkey. And they arrive at a place called Troas, and then Paul has a dream. It's in Acts 16, verses 9 and 10. And a vision appeared to Paul in the night. A man of Macedonia was standing there urging him, saying, come over to Macedonia and help us. When Paul had seen the vision, immediately we, did you notice that? This is the first time we see that in the book of Acts, sought to go on into Macedonia, concluding that God had called us to preach the gospel to them. Now, how important was this? This is the first intentional move of Christianity into the Western world out of Asia. Yeah, some of the diaspora lives in the West. There's a big Jewish population in Spain. There's also one in Rome. But this is the first intentional move of Christianity out of an area that was kind of where they were before, which was, you know, the area that they'd been birthed in. It meant a deliberate move now is taking place to take Jesus and the word to the world, just like Jesus commanded. He said that this was going to happen. Well, they're now doing it. So they arrive in Macedonia, which today is part of Greece, and some of it is part of Macedonia as well today. And they do ministry in a place called Philippi. And they saw a lot of folks come to the Lord. And they saw a lot of lives being changed there. And there was this one woman that kept following Paul, who was demon-possessed and was a fortune teller, kept bugging Paul. And he let it go on for a while, and he finally got fed up with it, turned around and cast the demon out of her, and she got saved. But there were guys who were making money off of her, and they didn't like that. So they had Paul and Silas arrested and beaten in the marketplace. So if you take a look at Philippi today, and you look at the Forum, in the foreground you see the Via Ignatia, which is the main road that was built by the Romans that goes all the way west towards Rome. It was built specifically for the use of moving troops back and forth. Now, in the distance, you see what is called the Bema seat. That's the judgment area, but that's the Forum. That's where Paul and Silas would have been arrested. They would have then been drug over to the Bema seat on the far end of that photograph, beaten, and then taken back to the prison, which is right there next to the main drag, where they're off of the Via Egnatia. And it was a very well-built prison, as you can tell. Some of it still stands today, but it wasn't exactly the best place that you'd want to stay. I mean, it was a prison built probably by Rome in around 10 AD or thereabouts. But it wasn't all bad while they were in prison. Paul and Silas were praying, they were singing worship music, and the Lord freed them by virtue of an earthquake. Rather than leave, they remained. They were able to see the jailer come to Christ and his entire family come to Christ. And they even baptized them. So the next morning, those guys who drugged them across the forum and then beat them publicly and then drugged them across the forum again to prison wanted to release them. And at this point, Paul mentions something to them that they were not able to tell the folks about before. By the way, guys, Silas and I are Roman citizens. And that suddenly put fear in the hearts of the leadership, because to beat Roman citizens without a trial and publicly, as they just did, means that they would be taken out and crucified. So they were a little bit concerned about their own well-being. They wanted to kind of let them go without doing it. They showed up and they publicly apologized to Paul and Silas and said, "You guys need to leave town." They eventually did, but they did assert their rights under the law. And that's something that we need to be aware of too, as Christians living in the 21st century, especially with what we're seeing happen around us today. We need to remember that. We may reach a point in being here in the West that we may have to start asserting our rights under the law as well in order to continue doing ministry. I know that's already happening in some of the states of this nation, such as California and Colorado and New York and others, but it's something we have to be aware of. We have to know what the law actually says that we can do and walk right up to doing ministry and being bold for the Lord, but at the same time ready to deal with the fact that you may run up against people, well, not may, you will run up against people who don't want you there. As we stand up and minister for the Lord in our current culture, we have to be prepared to encounter a term, Christianiophobia. In other words, there are people who are phobic of Christians. Christians who do not challenge the ideas of the culture, they don't care. It doesn't bother them. But if you're theologically or politically conservative, like a Calvary Chapel, we tend to challenge progressive social and political attitudes. In other words, we don't buy what the culture says about sexuality, and we don't buy what the culture says about a lot of other things too. So we tend to draw the ire of those who have an axe to grind against Christians, and we get anti-Christian hostility. And actually, Christianiophobia is the irrational hatred and fear directed toward conservative Christians, and it's now being observed in this country. It's now happening here. The team that heads southwest on the Via Egnatia through Macedonia, they leave and they head to Thessalonica. That's the next big city on the road. And Paul, as he normally does, starts in a synagogue, and he's teaching about Jesus, and there are some who are saved, but most of the people saved in Thessalonica are Gentiles. And they're in Greece now. The culture is Greek. It's very different than back home in Jerusalem. And what they're seeing is there are a lot of women of high station who are coming to Christ, and their husbands weren't. They had not seen that before. Usually it's the whole family. Now they're seeing just women coming, or just men, but not the whole families. And it's a totally different culture. People who are getting saved now come from a totally pagan mindset, and they have all the baggage that comes along with that. And you don't see that much of it dealing with what we read in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, but if you want to see what the baggage looks like, just read 1st and 2nd Corinthians. Or as my Bible teacher used to call it at Biola, yeah, we're going to studying the cruddy Corinthians. I used to call it 1st and 2nd Californians, but that's just me. The Via Egnatia, though, was built by the Romans, and it's really a beautiful Roman road. It's still in existence today. You can drive probably a Jeep on it if you want to, but it's basically built for walking and for horseback and for dragging chariots and that type of thing on it. And it's well built. This is an example of what it looks like today. I mean, That's how you travel. You would travel on a Roman road, and the Roman roads were well built. Straight, yeah, like an arrow. They had all kinds of devices to make sure that everything was done correctly, and some of these roads are actually better built than freeways are today because, they've lasted for 3,000 years. Unlike some of our freeways that can't last for 30 weeks, But Macedonian women in this part of the world at this time had a well-earned reputation for independence. And many of them were business women, and they built businesses, and they didn't even share it with their husbands. I mean, we wouldn't see a lot different of the culture there than what we see in our nation today. And if some of the women there believed the gospel at their time, and they were the wives of leading citizens, it was not unusual for them to do that and leave their husbands behind. This is not an unusual thing. But for the Jewish mindset, that's not usual. That's not normal. So you got Paul and Silas trying to deal with that. Timothy's okay with it. He's a Greek. He kind of grew up in that environment. And they've got a doctor traveling with them now, Dr. Luke. He's Greek too. So you've got this mix of cultures that are traveling, and they're trying to understand what's going on. And of course, Dr. Luke at this point is busy taking care of Paul and Silas, who got beat pretty well while they were in Philippi. But they started in the synagogue, and some of the folks in the synagogue weren't happy about that because they were also in the business of trying to convert some of these pagans to Judaism. They were wanting to make proselytes. And they would go to the forum there in Thessalonica, and they would talk to them just as Paul was also going and talking to them. We actually know what the forum looks like. It's still standing in Thessalonica today. So on the one hand, you have Jews looking to expand their footprint by attracting some of the Gentiles there to worship Yahweh. And there were always usually some Greek followers. Those were usually the first to come to Christ when Paul would show up in the synagogue. Because there's this little issue that the Jews were insistent on, and it was this pesky issue of circumcising the men. And then there's all those rules and laws that you got to follow too. And if you've grown up in a pagan environment, I got to do what? I can't eat what? But I like bacon. What do you mean I can't eat bacon anymore? Well, it's a pig. I don't care. That's the kind of stuff that you have to deal with. Then these Christian missionaries show up and they're teaching, and some of them are Jewish, but they're sitting there not noshing on the bacon, and they're going like, hey, it's good food, it's from the Lord. And they're going like, aren't you Jewish? Yeah, but we're Christians. And they're not teaching those laws that the Jews taught, and they're not teaching that you have to follow them. And they're not teaching you got to get circumcised either. All you have to do is believe in Jesus Christ, that he died on the cross, rose from the dead, and that you're a sinner, and you need to repent of that. Well, many of them already knew about the sin part. They learned that from the Jews, but the rest of it was liberating and freeing, and that's what they wanted. So that's why you have a lot of them coming to Christ. And the Jews weren't happy about this because they thought they were going to be seeing all these folks become Jewish, and they weren't. And in Thessalonica, it created jealousy. Imagine being jealous over the work of the Lord. Well, that's what they were. And I'd love to say we don't see that happen anymore today. I can't say that. I know of at least 3 or 4 churches that were created solely because of jealousy taking place in staffs and senior pastors firing people. I know that. It still happens today. But some in the synagogue were indeed jealous. Paul and the team had only been there 3 weeks. 3 weeks. And as far as some of the folks in the synagogue were concerned, that was too long. They were able to convince some of the really fine, upstanding citizens who hung out in the forum, the ones with the leather jackets, riding the horses without the chariots, and they would make the horses make loud noises. They're not motorcycles, but they're just horses. They were hoods, okay? And they got them to conspire against Paul and the team. Well, Paul and the team found out about this conspiracy. They had been staying with Jason, one of the guys at the synagogue, and when they showed up at Jason's house to take him to the magistrate, they weren't there. They were absent. So they grabbed Jason and anybody else who was there, and they go and stir up the crowd. And they went, Paul and the team, these guys are terrible. I love the accusations against them. It's classic. It's in Acts 17, verses 6 and 7. When they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers, brand new Christians, before the city authorities, shouting, "These men have turned the world upside down." Well, they have come here also, and Jason has received them. And they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another king, Jesus. And that's all true. In fact, in less than 100 years, there's going to be some of them in that same city dying rather than saying Caesar is Lord. So, I mean, that's very true. But the net impact of all of this is Paul and the team had been there 3 weeks. And now they have to go to Berea. And the reason why they go to Berea is it's off that main drag. They go 30 miles south, hoping they get away from this. Well, the same group that got them booted out of Thessalonica, most of them Jewish, a few of these Gentiles involved, show up in Berea and they start agitating the folks there too. So they split up. Paul takes a boat to Athens, and Silas and Timothy and the rest of the gang go by land. So Paul's in Athens waiting for the rest of the team to show up, and that's not a small trip. They're halfway along the Greek peninsula, and Athens is way down at the bottom. They finally all arrive in Athens, and Paul, what does he do? He says, I'm still concerned about those folks in Thessalonica. He sends Timothy right back to Thessalonica. So Timothy gets on a boat, and off he goes, back to Thessalonica. Meanwhile, Paul and Silas go to Corinth. And there they were able to minister for a time being without being shoved out. By the way, if you want to know what Mars Hill looks like, it's really nothing to look at. It looks like a big rock in the middle of the ground. That's Mars Hill. Looking at it from the Acropolis, that's where Paul went and taught. Now Timothy has met up with them in Corinth. This is what's happened. And it's been about 1.5 years since they were in Thessalonica. He's come back from Thessalonica, and Paul and Silas catch up with what Timothy has to say, and they're excited. So they get together and they write this letter based on what they hear from Timothy. This letter is from that team, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, back to the believers that they left there when they were forced to leave without saying goodbye. Now, if you've ever done a study of the letters of Paul, you'll immediately see that the normal method he uses to begin the letter here in Thessalonians is different. And by the way, this is probably the first letter he writes. In fact, it is the first document written that goes into the New Testament. It predates Matthew. It was written at around 51 AD. It was very early. But he's writing from Corinth, which is the site of the temple of Apollos and all kinds of idol worship, and you name it, it was going on. And it is reflected in what he winds up writing to the Corinthians later. But by the reckoning of most New Testament scholars, he wrote this letter around 51 AD. So it's the earliest Christian writing we have, and it's the earliest evidence we have of the Christianity being spread into the West with missionaries. And it's actually the first item that was considered to be part of the canon of what we call now the New Testament. In fact, it was the folks in Thessalonica who collected all of them and created a codex with all of them in it. That's one of the things they did. So all three of these guys are referenced up front in the letter. They had a part in the writing of it. But we'll see that Paul becomes a little more predominant in the letter as time goes through, as we get through the letter. But it's being written to an audience that is predominantly Gentile, not Jewish. They have a little bit of knowledge of Jewish practices, but not much more than a little bit of knowledge. This is a Greek city. It is the Roman Empire of that section of Macedonia. It is the capital city of that portion of Macedonia. So it was Rome as far as everybody was concerned there. It is the seat of Roman power. A little background for you on Thessalonica. It was founded in 315 BC by Cassander. If you studied history, Cassander was involved with a guy named Alexander the Great. He destroyed 26 towns because he didn't want to have to deal with that, and he made everybody move to Thessalonica. That's how they founded it.
Thanks for joining us today for this edition of the UnSafe Bible. Pastor Ken Brown has been leading us in a study through the book of 1 Thessalonians. This letter to the church in Thessalonica is centered around the persecution the Thessalonians were experiencing because of their faith in Jesus. The Roman authorities were not thrilled with the fact that they were proclaiming the reign of a new heavenly king. But despite the persecution and trials, the Thessalonian church thrived. And Paul was extremely fond of the people he and Silas had come to know in their time of church planting. As we learn from this book, let's remember that while the enemy will try to tear our communities apart, the fellowship we have with other believers is a bond that this world cannot destroy. If you're near Hobe Sound, Florida, and are looking for that kind of faithful church community, why not pay us a visit at Calvary Chapel, Martin County? For more information about our in-person services, be sure to visit us online at theunsafebible.com. While you're there, you'll also find our media page, which has hundreds more messages from Pastor Ken from all corners of the Bible. If you'd like to reach out to us to share how God is speaking to you through today's study, you can also fill out our Connect card online, and we will get back to you to celebrate what God is doing in you. We believe that God's mercies are new every morning, and so is the wisdom that we can glean from His Word. Join us next time for another great teaching here on the UnSafe Bible.